This is a Saddlebred Lord of the Ring resin. I've resculpted a new mane and also put a new tail in this guy. He's a commission. First I used this paint. This is Pearlized Createx. It's an airbrush color and it's called Pearl Copper. This guy's going to be a Liver Chestnut. I'm starting out with this base color. And I'm going to build some layers of rich, deep reddish browns. This will be the color that he's going to be. This is Burnt Sienna, Comart, and I'll mix a drop of Badger Black with that. And it gives me a really rich brown. It's not quite as flat as the Comart Burnt Umber. That tends to be a little bit of a dead color to me, so I always either mix metallics with it or I don't really use a whole lot of it. But you get a super rich brown with this Burnt Sienna, and I like to use just a drop of black. I'll be using an Iwata Micron airbrush. This is a gravity feed brush. I usually just put a few drops of paint in it at a time. When I'm doing base colors, I use this brush. This is an Iwata HPC, also a gravity feed. Gravity feed means the cup's on the top. And it's a dual action brush. Dual action means you push down for air. When you pull back, you get paint. And that's the compressor you hear running in the background. So down for air, back for paint. Okay, we're going to mix up some paint. I typically mix my colors right in my gun. So we'll start out with 8 drops of Burnt Sienna. Since I just need a tiny little bit of the black, I'll just put a drop of it on my palette over here. And then I like to use these clay shapers. I'll just pick up a drop of the paint on the clay shaper and mix it into my brush. And you can see how quickly that gets dark. I like to start out on the tummy of the horse. I get a little better idea of the color. I do have a paper pad that I spray on that's off to the right. I'm not sure if you can see that in the picture or not. And I check the paint and the airbrush on that first to see that things are working right. And then come over here and I start building up layers on my horse. As I paint this guy, I'm going to try to stay lighter around his flanks and a little bit lighter across the center of his back because that's where I want to put the more detail of the dappling. I do several layers of airbrush to build my base colors, and later on, after these are dry, then I finish out the top coats with oils. I don't use a whole lot of paint at one given time because I don't want it to dry in my airbrush. If you have a lot of paint in your gun, as you're painting, it tends to dry along the sides. Let's get another drop of black here. And then sometimes that can drop down into your gun and cause clogs and chunks come out. So, I mean, unfortunately, that's inevitable and it's going to happen. But if you can avoid it, it makes painting a whole lot more pleasant. Okay, again, we're mixing the Burnt Sienna and a drop of Badger Black. And we're getting a nice dark chocolatey color. Can you see that? This paint is finely ground. And so coverage is minimal, but you don't get a lot of grain that you will get if you're using a more coarsely ground pigment. So it takes a lot more layers to cover. You still have to remember to be light-handed. Don't get impatient and want to get too much coverage at once. You just have to be patient, build thin layers, and your paint work will have so much more depth. It's not like painting a house. You don't want to get it all done in one coat. I'm not sure you can see, but I paint without the cap on the needle, so the needle is actually exposed. And what I like to do as I'm painting is I have a little jar of, it's not even a jar, it's a little tiny container of a Windex and water mixture that I'll drip a Q-tip, or put a Q-tip into and then clean the tip of the brush off, as paint will tend to dry on the tip of the brush. And then I hold the Q-tip up to the end of the brush, and when I see the paint wicks into the brush, I know that I have a nice clean needle and nice clean tip. Okay, so I'm continuing to build shading. I'm going to make sure we paint the insides of the ears. You want to work over the whole horse all at once, building thin layers, developing your shading. Remember to stay a little bit lighter across the back, a little bit lighter in the flank. And build your color evenly over the whole horse. I've made the mistake of painting one side of the horse and then coming over and trying to match the other side to the first side, and it never works right. So I've been airbrushing since the mid-70s. I learned airbrushing in college, pretty much on my own. They didn't really have a class for it. Back then I was actually airbrushing photographs. I was learning to do the hand coloring techniques. And I mostly used Dr. Martin's paints back then, Dr. Martin's Radiance. I've been painting for maybe about a half an hour now, or maybe a little longer than that, and I've built up several more layers. You'll see he's got more of a bronze color now, quite a bit darker. And I'm going to continue with what I'm doing. Again, the burnt sienna, but now I'm adding just a little bit more of the Badger Black. I love Badger Black because it has such a smooth consistency. The pigment is extremely finely ground. I don't like to use it straight because it does tend to be a little bit sticky, but mixed with other paints, it's just wonderful. It adds wonderful shade. And it's a rich black. It's not a cold black, it's not a warm black, it's just black. A cold black typically means that it's got a blue tinge to it. So if you mix it with red, it's going to look purpley. And a warm black means that it's more of a brownish color. And I do like that in some instances. But if I want like nice black legs on a buckskin, I don't want brown. I need a nice, even, clean black. Okay, so what I'm working on now is just building up a little more shading on the muscles. And continuing to develop this rich liver chestnut color. Oh, my head's not in the way there. With a color like liver chestnut, you have to try to leave some areas of light, and I mean areas where you don't build up quite as many layers of paint. Because a liver chestnut can be a really smooth, even color, and yet you don't want it to be a dead color. You need areas that have highlights, areas of shading, and yet still give the impression of an overall even tone. And so you learn to look closely at the coloring on a horse. For example, on this horse, I noticed that in the reference photos I have that the areas right around the gaskin, the hip bones, and behind the elbows, along the shoulders, these are some of the areas that tend to have a little darker shading. As I'm painting, I like to keep the brush moving. You don't want to spend a lot of time in one spot because then you'll get what's called a hot spot, where the paint will be too heavy and it'll run. It might develop into a fisheye, or it'll bubble up, or it'll do some unsightly, unwanted thing that'll be really, really hard to fix. Right now I'm adding a little extra shading and darkening to the joints. Although regular chestnuts tend to be a little lighter above the coronary band on their, just below the pastern. Liver chestnut looks pretty much even all the way down. Okay, I can hear the airbrush whistling a little bit, and usually what that means is I'm getting a little bit of paint built up on the needle. So I'm going to take a minute and clean that off. Dip my Q-tip in some Windex, and you'll see the paint from the needle come off onto the Q-tip. See that? Okay, then I pull the needle into the brush without depressing it. I don't want to spray, I just want to pull the needle back into the brush and make sure I have paint wicking onto the Q-tip. When you see that, that means your tip's clean. Once again, wipe it off. And then I do a little bit of a test spray over here on this pad that I have, just some extra paper. Make sure my brush is cleaning well. Any spatters will go over there, not on the horse. Then you want to start, I spray out here before the horse and then move on to the horse. That way I don't get a hot spot I don't end up with spatter. Well, I might still end up with spatter, but it's less likely. As I'm painting, sometimes a speck of dust will land on the horse. There's just, it's unavoidable when you work that there's going to be dust in the air, and sometimes it gets caught up and will land on your horse, and you'll spray it before you can do anything about it. So I like to keep, this is one of Rio Rondo's scraping tools, and this has this sort of a roundish edge to it, and I like to use that, and it just is amazing to lift off specks and hair and dust and just about anything else, and it doesn't ruin your paint. It'll just take that schmutz right off, and you can go on painting. You have to make sure you get the backs of the legs too. And underneath the stomach. Working on some shading on the face. I do like to work on a Lazy Susan. This way I can turn the horse and work on the horse all over. Keep the gun moving and not have to hold the horse. Out of paint. Okay. More burnt sienna. And as I'm working, each time I go on to another layer of color, I'm adding a little more black. First I started with just one little scoop on this clay shaper, and now I'm adding 5 scoops. A scoop pretty much turns out to be just a small drop. I know these are sort of innocuous terms, but painting is an art, not a science, I guess. And so I just keep darkening the color and working from my reference photo and building up the layers. If it gets too dark in the cup, then I'll save it for later and come back and use it for another layer later or another horse. Testing over here on my pad to make sure my brush is spraying properly before I spray my horse. Clean my needle. Make sure it's wicking, clean it again, and we're good to go. When I start painting again, I like to start someplace a little less conspicuous. That way if my color isn't exactly what I want, it's not right in the middle of my horse and I'm stuck with a big problem. So I'll start either on the tummy or on a lower leg. A lot of times your horses will have white on their lower legs, and so you can actually use the legs as an experimental area to start testing your paint before you put it on your horse's body. Still continuing to develop the shading on this Liver Chestnut. I'm going to stop the video here for a few minutes and continue to work, and then I'll come back and show you a little farther along. I'm going to darken the hip areas, the legs, the stomach, and I'm going to stay out of this area here. See how that's got this lovely shimmery gold to it still. I want to save that for some dappling. Once I build up the dappling, then I can put some shading back into that area. But we're going to leave that, so that'll be the area that shows off the dappling. We want those dapples to really shimmer and have some nice life to them. Okay, we'll see you in a few minutes. Okay, here we've gotten several more layers of dark shading. And we're still staying in that nice chocolate colored liver base color family. I know it might be a little hard to see at this stage, but when you look at the reference photo, you can see we're staying in that same color family. You just want to keep building up the dark colors. It's almost black, but I like to build from light to dark, and that way I can maintain the life in my color. So we're going to continue building more dark layers. Right now, I thought he was getting a little too brownish gold, so I'm spraying just a layer of burnt sienna to bring back more red tones. He's going to be liver chestnut with a flaxen mane and tail. It'll probably be more of a reddish flaxen to really be a nice dramatic accent to the almost black body color that he'll end up being. Okay, we're going to break here. I'll continue building up the dark layers, and we'll come back when we have some more dark shading.